Have you ever noticed how your heart starts to race just because your phone vibrated on the nightstand? Or how you find yourself mentally rehearsing a simple explanation for why you're 5 minutes late, even though nobody asked? It's that heavy feeling in your chest when someone's tone of voice shifts slightly. Not a shout, not an argument, but your body reacts as if a storm is about to break. You might think this is just who you are, that you're just anxious or too sensitive. But what if I told you these aren't personality traits at all? They're actually pieces of protective software, a survival code your brain wrote a long time ago to keep you safe when the world felt unpredictable. You aren't broken. You're a survivor who is still wearing armor even though the war ended years ago. Today we're going to peel back the layers on 9 specific things you do every day that seem completely normal, but are actually silent echoes of trauma living in your nervous system. If you've ever felt like you're constantly reacting to ghosts from your past, comment the word "aware" below, and hit that like and subscribe button so we can keep exploring the depths of the human mind together. Because once you understand why your body is stuck on high alert, you can finally start to teach it that it's safe to come home, starting with a habit so common we often mistake it for being polite. Sign 1. Think about the last time you made a tiny mistake or a simple change of plans. Instead of just saying, "I can't make it," did you find yourself spiraling into a 10-minute monologue, giving every possible detail and backstory just to justify a 30-second decision? It's that desperate internal need to make sure the other person understands exactly where you're coming from so they don't get angry or misinterpret your heart. You might think you're just being thorough or transparent, but in reality, this is a classic trauma response born from a place where your word wasn't enough. You likely grew up in an environment where your intentions were constantly twisted, where you weren't believed, or where no was treated like a declaration of war. So, you learned to build a fortress of words to protect yourself from the accusations you're still expecting to hear. You're trying to prevent a fire that isn't even burning anymore. But as exhausting as it is to constantly defend your right to exist, there is another signal that is much quieter. One that manifests as a physical glitch in your body the moment the room gets a little too loud. Sign 2. It happens in an instant. A door slams down the hall or a heavy spoon hits the kitchen floor, and while everyone else barely blinks, you feel it like a physical blow to the chest. It's not just being startled, it's the way your breath hitches, your muscles lock into a cold stiffness, and your heart begins to pound against your ribs as if you've just run a marathon. You might laugh it off as being jumpy, but this is your nervous system performing a high-speed scan of the environment, searching for a threat that isn't there. This deep-seated freeze or flight response is a biological souvenir from a time when a raised voice or a sudden noise was the first warning sign of an incoming storm, a conflict you had to survive. Your body is essentially a soldier still patrolling a border where the war ended years ago, unable to distinguish a dropped object from a direct attack. You are living in a state of perpetual high alert that drains your battery before the day even begins. And yet, while your body is busy reacting to these external sounds, there's an even invisible trap you might be falling into, one where you feel like a failure the moment you actually try to stop and rest. Sign 3. You know that restless, gnawing anxiety that creeps in the second you sit down on the couch to just exist? It's that internal voice that whispers you're being lazy or wasting time because you aren't crossing something off a list. You might think you're just a high achiever or someone with a strong work ethic, but there is a darker edge to it, a sense of guilt so intense it feels like a physical weight. This is the obsessive productivity trap, and its roots go deep into a past where your value was conditional. You likely learned very early on that you were only safe, seen, or loved when you were being useful, when you were achieving, or when you were making someone else's life easier. For you, doing nothing doesn't feel like rest. It feels like danger, because if you aren't performing, you aren't valuable. You are living in a state of constant survival, treating your worth like a battery that has to be recharged every single day through exhaustion. But while you're busy trying to prove your worth through what you do, you might be losing the very essence of who you are by shifting your shape to fit everyone else's world. Sign 4. Have you ever noticed that you seem to have a different version of yourself for every person you meet? One minute, you're the upbeat, energetic friend. The next, you're the quiet, serious professional, or the agreeable listener who never disagrees with a controversial opinion. You might think you're just socially fluid or a people person, but this chameleon effect is often a sophisticated survival mechanism. It's the result of growing up in a world where being your authentic self was actually a risk. You learned that the safest way to exist was to become a mirror, to reflect exactly what the other person in front of you wanted to see so that you could avoid rejection, criticism, or conflict. You aren't being fake, you are being a protector. You've become so good at reading the room and anticipating others' needs that you've forgotten what your own voice actually sounds like. You've spent your life shrinking and expanding to fit into the spaces others left for you. But there is an even quieter way this trauma shows up, a tiny two-syllable word that you use like a shield, even when you've done nothing wrong. Sign 5. I'm sorry, can I just ask a quick question? Or, sorry, I'm just trying to get through. You find yourself whispering these words when someone else bumps into you, or when you're simply existing in a shared space. It's an automatic reflex, a verbal tic that makes people see you as exceptionally polite, but deep down, it's not about manners, it's about fear. You're apologizing for the inconvenience of your own existence. This habit is a scar from a past where taking up space, having needs, or even being noticed carried a heavy price, perhaps rejection, silence, or a sudden outburst of anger. You learned that the safest way to move through the world was to be as small and invisible as possible, asking for permission to breathe so you wouldn't suffer later. You've become a master at apologizing for things you didn't even do, just to keep the peace. But this constant shrinking leads to a dangerous kind of isolation, a wall you build around yourself where you refuse to let anyone in, even when you're completely exhausted and drowning.
I've got it, or I can do it myself. You say these words even when your hands are shaking with exhaustion or your heart is heavy with a grief you can't name. To the outside world, you look like a powerhouse, the person who always has it figured out and never breaks. But this radical self-reliance isn't a strength, it's a shield you forged out of necessity. It comes from a past where, when you finally reached out for a hand, no one was there to grab it. Or worse, they helped you, but then held that help over your head like a debt you could never repay. You learned that depending on someone else was a gamble where you always lost, so you decided that the only safe person in the world was you. You would rather drown in silence than risk the vulnerability of being told no one more time. You were carrying a mountain on your shoulders because you're terrified of what happens if you let someone else touch it. But while you're busy being the strong one, your mind might be doing something even more strange. It might be erasing the very memories that explain why you became this way in the first place. When you sat down with friends or family and listened to them recount vivid stories of being 8 or 10 years old, only to realize that for you, those years are just blank. You search for the details, the names of teachers, the layout of your bedroom, or the feeling of a specific summer, but all you find is a thick gray fog. You might feel like you just have a bad memory, but this is often the work of your brain's most sophisticated defense mechanism, dissociation. When the world you lived in became too chaotic, too painful, or too lonely to process, your brain stepped in like a protective vault. It decided that the only way to save you was to tune out the reality of what was happening, essentially hitting the record button, but refusing to save the file. These memory gaps aren't just forgetfulness, they are the scars of a mind that had to go elsewhere to survive. Your brain didn't fail you, it protected you by hiding the truth until you were strong enough to handle it. But even as your mind hides the past, your body remains hyper-aware of the present, constantly scanning every room for a danger that hasn't arrived yet. When you walk into a coffee shop or a party, do you find yourself instinctively choosing the seat that faces the door? Before you've even ordered your drink, you've already noted where the emergency exits are and precisely measured the vibe of everyone in the room. You might think you're just highly perceptive or have a sixth sense for people, but this is actually hypervigilance. You are reading the micro-expressions on a stranger's face and the subtle shifts in a friend's tone of voice because once upon a time, your safety depended on your ability to predict an explosion before it happened. You had to become an expert at sensing the weather of a room to know when to hide, when to appease, or when to run. Your body hasn't realized that the storm has passed. It's still operating on a high alert frequency that burns through your energy and leaves you exhausted in ways most people never see. You are constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, even in your most beautiful moments. And this inability to trust the good times is perhaps the most painful cage of all. You finally land the job you wanted, or you meet someone who treats you with genuine kindness, but instead of feeling joy, you feel a cold sense of dread. You're waiting, you're watching the clock, convinced that this is all just a cruel setup before the floor falls out from under you. You might think you're just a realist or a pessimist, but this fear of good news is a defense mechanism developed in a past where every high was followed by a crushing low. When your early life taught you that happiness was always interrupted by a crisis, your brain learned to stop trusting the light. Now you sabotage your own peace or distance yourself from people who love you because in your mind, controlling when the pain happens makes it hurt less. You've built a life where you're constantly braced for impact, even when there's nothing but open sky in front of you. It's a heartbreaking way to live, always surviving, never arriving. But there is a truth about these 9 signals that changes everything, and it's something your body has been waiting to hear for a very long time. Recognizing these patterns in yourself might feel heavy, but I want you to take a breath and realize something vital. These behaviors aren't evidence that you are broken or defective. They are the ultimate evidence of your resilience. They are the strategies you developed to stay whole in a world that wasn't. Think of it this way. You were trying to navigate a brand new, safe city using an old, tattered map of a war zone. That map saved your life when you were under fire, but it's making you get lost today because the dangers it warns you about simply aren't there anymore. You are fighting battles that have already ended and fleeing from shadows that have no power over you.
The problem isn't who you are. It's just that your internal software hasn't received the update that you are finally safe. You don't have to carry this exhaustion or live on autopilot forever. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out to a professional, a psychologist or therapist, to help you redraw that map and finally put down the armor that's become too heavy to wear. Because at the end of the day, healing isn't about building a new version of yourself. It's about peeling back the layers of protection to find the person you were always meant to be before the world told you that you had to hide. Thanks for being here. You aren't alone. I'll see you in the next one.